Hey folks, it's Nick here. So in this video, we're going to be covering WebViews in Flutter. So to use a WebView, which is like just displaying a web page in your Flutter app, you're going to need to use the WebView Flutter package. So this package you see in front of you is part of a larger set of plugins provided by the official Flutter plugins repository on GitHub. There's a link to it in the show notes, or you can just find it here by clicking the repository link here where the package is defined. And you can see what packages you have available to you, which is all kinds of stuff like working with the camera, a video player, Firebase, device sensors, all that stuff. So all we need to do in this tutorial is install this package and kind of get it implemented in a simple screen. So let's get started. Okay, so to start, we're going to create a new Flutter project. So I'm going to open a terminal, and I'm using OS X, but you can use Windows or Linux or whatever. And I'm going to use the Flutter CLI tool. So I'm going to say Flutter create, and then we're going to name our project Flutter WebViews. And I have all this final code on a GitHub repo. You can see it in the show notes if you don't want to follow along. Next, I'm going to open my Flutter project by typing code, which is standing for Visual Studio Code, and then the directory, so Flutter WebViews. So it's going to open my project there. And let me make this full screen. And then so next, I'm going to open main.dart in the lib directory. And I'm going to clear out all this code here because we're not going to need it. It's too complex. There's nothing we can really use here. I'm just going to say for my main function, run app, and then I'm going to use we're going to implement a widget called app, and that app is going to contain a screen that just shows a basic button. So let's do that next. So before we create app, I'm just going to import it, even though the file's not there yet, import app.dart. And then I'm going to save it. And then I'm going to click new file, create a file called app.dart in the lib directory. And now the app is supposed to just basically have a material app widget at its core. So let me paste in the boilerplate here. So we don't have to type it out. And the basic boilerplate of our Flutter app will just be a stateless widget called app. And it's just going to have a build method. That's it. Yeah, so now we're going to implement what's inside. So I'm going to say material app. I'm going to return a material app, and that's going to allow us to provide a title, and we're going to have some theme data. So I'm going to paste in the theme data because it's not covered in this tutorial. It just makes our app look a little nicer. And then I'm going to say home, and then we're going to load a screen called home, and we're going to implement that next. So if you're new to Flutter, don't worry about the theme data. And actually, it's optional to implement this if you want to follow along. I just like to have it because it looks nicer that way, but I'm not going to explain all this out for you. So next, we're going to have to import home. So we're going to say import screens home.dart. And we have screens here because I like to put all my main screens of the app in a directory called screens. So next, let's actually implement home.dart. So before we continue, if you're using iOS, there's a special configuration option you need to define in your Xcode project's info.plist file. And that configuration is located on the plugin page. And basically, you have to add a key called io.flutter.embeddedviews preview. So if you're on iOS, let's go into the iOS directory and then /runner and then info.plist. And then here, we're going to add a key to the dictionary here with that value and the key. And then we're going to add the value of that key, that corresponding key, to yes. There. And then we're going to save it. And then if we have our project running, we want to stop the project and rebuild, and it should work. So that's just one thing to note if you're using iOS. Cool, so let's create home.dart. So I'm going to have a new folder. I'm going to say right-click lib and say new folder. I'm going to call it screens. So it's very clear that everything in here is a screen. and I say new file for that, and I'm going to say home.dart. And now home.dart is basically going to have just a simple scaffold with just the button we're going to define. So let me import the core of it here. I'm going to just copy and paste it. And then we're going to say home, the class home extends a stateless widget because we don't really need state here. And next what I want to do is I'm going to define like the links for our button. So we're going to only show one link for now because I want to keep the tutorial simple. And that link will be the title of the button that we're going to show and also the actual URL we want to go to when we tap that button. So to do that, I'm going to create a private member here for home, denoted by the underscore here because it's private. And I'm just going to hard code a list by these square brackets, the URLs we want. I'm going to just have one URL, https google.com. That's it. So now let's implement our build method. So build context. And then we're going to just have a scaffold, which gives us a basic screen. And the scaffold will have a body. And what we want to do is define a single like column that you can scroll. So if you have many buttons, you can scroll it. So to do that, and because we're using iOS, I'm going to define a safe area. iOS or Android, it doesn't matter, but what safe area does, it makes sure that if you have a notch on your phone, which is this little black part on the top, that the content displays below it, not underneath it, and it's not obstructed. So we're just going to say safe area child. And since we have a single item in our scroll view, it's going to be a single column. There's a special widget called single child scroll view. And you can read the documentation for that later if you want to know more about it. And it's just going to have a single child called column. So column, if you don't know, displays a list of items from top to bottom in a single column. And that's just like a really common component in Flutter. And main axis alignment will be center, and here axis alignment center, and cross axis alignment will be stretch, because we want to stretch every item of our column from left to right. And then I'm going to have a list of children here, and this is where we create our single button. And if we have many buttons, it'll render it that way as well. So I can just show you that there's a special map function. And so what it's going to do is it's going to take every item in our links list here. So there's only one item in this list, but it is a list. It's an array, basically. And I'm going to say for each item, map it to an actual widget. So it's going to take the information, which is the link, which is a string value. And we're going to generate a button. And we're not going to do it in this main code here because it's going to get too messy. So we're going to implement a function called URL button. We're going to pass in the contents and the link itself. And that link, so then for every item in this map, it's going to render a URL button. Now, the map will return something like a list of items mapped, but we still have to convert it to a list at the end of the day because that's what the column widget is expecting. So whenever we map a few things, we're going to have two lists at the end. And now let's implement our URL button method. So a URL button method will return a widget. And let's see here. Just referring to my notes. It'll return a simple widget, and it'll include some build context and the URL we want to show. So this is going to be a simple container because we want to style it like the background. We're going to add some padding, and I like to use a container because a container is kind of like the div of Flutter. And we're going to give it some padding, edge insets all, so of 20. And then the child is going to be a flat button. So flat button is a material design widget that just gives us a simple flat button. And it's really simple. And that button is styled by our theme in our app.dart file. So we can say the color of the button, and we're going to get the theme of primary color of our app. So we set it to blue in app.dart. See, primary swatch blue. So if you want to learn more about theming, that's another tutorial, or you can look at the Flutter documentation, but this is how I'm styling my button. And then padding, I'm going to say edge insets symmetric, and then horizontal 50, and then let's see what I want for vertical. I guess vertical, I'm going to say 15. Okay, so next let's get to the real stuff here, which is the actual child. So every item in the button is just going to be a simple text label. So we want to have a text widget, and we're going to just show the URL in our text widget. Lastly, we have to implement what we're going to do when we press the button. So when we press the button, we want to implement the onPressed parameter. So the onPressed parameter is a callback. And so that is basically just a function you're passing into it. It's executing some function. So that function will be, we're going to call it handle URL button press. And we're going to pass in our context, our build context, and the URL. And let's see, that's it. So now let's implement that. And then we got to make sure that this is all ended right. Container is finished. Okay, cool. So handle URL button press, we're going to just copy and paste this in and take a in a build context and a string. And so this is when we do our navigation. So we're going to navigate to our screen here. So I'm going to say navigator.push, and that's going to push the screen into view. Now on iOS, this is not a common thing you do. You don't. Sometimes you might push in and display the screen from the right. The screen's going to slide in from the right. But on iOS, the style of iOS, a lot of the time you want to display it what's called a modal. And a modal is simply a screen coming up from the bottom. So that's a common iOS thing. I wouldn't worry about it, and we're not going to implement that for this lesson because we want to just keep it simple. But just make note of that it's not common to swipe in a web view that's just something like a modal from the right. So we're going to call the screen that's going to contain our web view a web view container, and that's what we're going to implement next. So we're just going to write this in as if we've implemented it already, web view container. And the container, we're going to pass our URL to the container, and then it's just going to display it in a web view. So that's it. So we end this, cool. And now we have to import the screen here. So since we're in home.dart already, we're going to just say webview container.dart. And next, we're going to implement the webview container. Okay, so WebView container, oh, I have a typo here, URL button. So the WebView container, we want to right click on screens here on the left and say web_view_container. And now let's implement this. So to implement a full screen that has the web view, there's a gotcha that I discovered. The screen that we're going to display has to be a stateful widget, not a stateless widget. And if you display a stateless widget, it'll just keep it, the web view will load like every millisecond and nothing will ever load for some reason. So we have to implement a stateful widget, and the state that we're going to have is our URL. So if our URL changes because it is a stateful widget, it will reload the page. And that's it. It's very simple. So to use the web view, we're going to import a package of what we installed. Actually, we didn't install it yet, so we'll do that now. WebView Flutter, WebView Flutter.dart. Now, so as you can see, like it's not there because we have to install it. So in our pubspec.yaml file, and I opened this. If you're using VS Code, I opened this file picker by Command or Control P, and then you just type the name of the file and you'll see it in the list here. We're going to install the WebView Flutter package. So I'm going to go down here to dependencies. And after this Cupertino icons item here in the list, I'm just going to say WebView Flutter : and then I'm going to open the package, and I'm going to see that the latest version is 0.3.3. So we're going to paste that in. So 0.3.3 preceded by a caret, and I'm going to save it. And then VS Code should automatically install this package here. So while it's doing that, looks like it's successful. Let's implement our screen. So we're going to implement a stateful widget called WebView container, extends a stateful widget. And since we're going to pass in our URL, we're going to have a constructor for this stateful widget called WebView container. And this URL, so what this URL does is that when you pass in the parameter here, when you instantiate this container, this widget, it's going to automatically assign the value to URL here because it's this.url. So that's just kind of like a Dart thing. That's a Dart feature that just makes it easy. And that way we don't have to implement the constructor body. It's just, we're defining it like this. Cool. So let's say create state here. We're going to override a special method called create state. This is how you create a stateful widget if you don't know. And then we're going to point it to a new class. So the new class we're going to have is a private class denoted by the underscore here called WebView container state. So here we have our WebView container. This is the widget itself, but we have our state, which is another class. And we're going to take our URL that was passed in, and we're going to pass the URL into the state because we want that URL part of our state. So now let's create the state. So we define the state here by saying class underscore, because it's private, WebView container state extends state, but it's state of type WebView container. So that's how you implement a stateful widget. And if you don't know enough about this, you can look at the documentation, or I have a tutorial on my site about implementing stateful widgets, and it goes into depth about what I'm doing here. And so for one item of state, like one piece of state we're going to have is the URL, because if the URL changes, we want to re-render the web page. Also, we have a key. So the key for our web view is something that's unique to, it allows us to identify our web view uniquely in the Flutter widget tree. So I won't get into the widget tree and all that, but basically it gives us a way for the Flutter system to uniquely locate and identify the web view we're going to use. And to generate a key, there's a special function in Flutter called unique key. So we're going to instantiate that key. We're going to automatically give it a value when this class is created by making an assignment when we define the member here. And next, we're going to implement our state. So because we want to pass in a URL to our state, we're going to define also here a constructor as well. So the constructor is WebView container state, and then going to pass in this URL. So again, like above, when we instantiate the state here, because I'm using this dot and then the member name, it's going to automatically assign it to this member here. Now let's implement the actual final part of it. So all we want to do is show a single scaffold. So we're going to say override widget build context, and then return scaffold. And we're going to have an app bar at the top. That's like a little navigation bar. And it's not going to have anything right now because we don't need it. And have the body is a single column. And it's going to have basically one child. So the child is going to have an expanded widget. An expanded widget, if you don't know, is a widget where all the contents, that whole widget expands to the full width and height of the screen, or as much as it can, the column will allow. So whatever the column will allow, it will expand that into that fully. So we have a full screen web view we can show. And finally, in the expanded widget, we are going to add our web view. So this is the core of the core takeaway of the tutorial. I'm just going to say web view. And there's just three basic parameters you define with the web view. One is the key, so that way we can uniquely refer to this widget. And if you don't know about keys, I would look it up in the Flutter documentation. And then there's this parameter called JavaScript mode. So it lets us control what JavaScript is run. If it's disabled, we're going to say unrestricted. So we can, when the web page loads, all of the JavaScript can load on that web page. And initial URL. So that URL, we're going to provide our member URL. Easy. So that's the URL we passed in. So then we end our list of children. And then we end our column and scaffold. Let's see. Yep. So this, and then this is the column. This is the scaffold, and that's it. So let's do this. Cool. All right. Looks like it worked. Yeah, that's it. So that's the overview. Let's try to run it. Oh, there's a bill there. Let's see. Expected to find this. Okay. And app.dart. That's cool. I have to end my material app widget here. Let's try to run it again. Cool. So I'm going to hit F5 if you're using Visual Studio Code, and F5 will build and run the app. Cool. So I rebuilt it. It's going to run now. Let's see if it works. Cool. So our WebView is working. It shows the Google homepage, nothing crazy. And we can go back. And we can go into it again. And yeah, that's cool. So if we add we can add in new buttons here. If we add in, we can add in here in home.dart, we can add in whatever button we want. So we can say https ://microsoft.com, hit save, hot reload. See, we have another button here. We can tap that, and it will load the Microsoft site, etc. Cool. So I hope you learned something. And now, like, once you know how to use this plugin, check out the other plugins that are the official Flutter plugins, and you can try those now. You know how to install a plugin via the pubspec YAML file and implement like a basic main and app file that shows a simple screen. We implemented a simple screen with a couple buttons, so you know how to do that. And finally, the web view, so a stateful widget showing a simple web view. And there's more options for WebView you can explore in the documentation, like detecting the gestures when you're in the WebView, and also some callbacks for like when the WebView is loaded, you can hook into those. So there's other options here, and if you want to see what options you have available, you can just like command click into WebView and look at the documentation here in the code. So thanks for watching, and see you next time.